At age 19, Charles Starkweather was already known for being a ruthless mass executioner. Between 1957 and 1958, Charles and his girlfriend ran around Nebraska snuffing 11 people for no apparent reason. Charles was a high school dropout who recently worked as a garbage man where he earned a reputation for yelling, "Go to hell!" to strangers while on the job. With that type of energy, he sounds like this big burly dude, right? Well, Charles was about 5'5" and had a pretty small build. He was like the human version of a chihuahua, little but fierce. And if Charles isn't already seemingly questionable enough, he was dating a girl named Caril who was about 5 years younger than him, which typically isn't a big deal, but he first started dating Caril when he was 18 and she was 13. That's a pretty big age gap as a teen and knowing Charles's personality. On November 30th, 1957, Charles went to a gas station with the intention of buying a stuffed animal for his girl. How romantic, right? When Charles made it to the register, he realized he didn't have enough money to buy the stuffed animal. He tried to get to the cashier, Robert, to sell him the stuffed animal on credit, but Robert said no and kicked Charles out. Throughout the night, Charles kept coming back to the gas station to buy a few small items with a pack of cigarettes and gum. But later that night, Charles returned for a third time wearing a bandana and a hat and a firearm in one hand. He pointed his weapon at Robert and ordered him to open the safe. He did. Charles then ordered Robert into his own car and told him to drive to a secluded area nearby. Once they got there, Charles slayed Robert using bullets. After the incident, Charles met up with Caril and told her about the robbery, but casually left out the part about slaying the dude. Right around then, Charles was fired as a trash guy and got evicted from his place because he couldn't afford rent. I wonder what he did with the money he stole from the safe then. Just a few months after Charles' first execution, he decided to go to Caril's house, and it wasn't just to say hi and hang out. No, he came over with a rifle and a bunch of ammo. When Charles got there, Caril's parents told him to stay away. He pointed his rifle at them and knocked them both out with bullets. He then went after their 2-year-old daughter. She was punctured with a blade and suffocated. Charles told Caril that he was holding her family hostage. He said that if she cooperated with him, her family would be spared. If not, they'd be snuffed. Well, come January 27th, 6 days after the initial home invasion, Caril's grandma came back and threatened to call 911 because she speculated something else was going on. Granny was right. After Charles and Caril got the warning, they left the Barlett home and drove 15 minutes away to stay with Charles' 70-year-old friend named August. Now, poor August had absolutely no idea what Charles and Caril had done and was nothing but generous to them when they came over. August even told the couple that they could use his horses to get their car out of the mud. But when the old man started walking towards the horse stable, Charles pulled out his trusty rifle and fired at August. Charles then beat up August's dog until it passed away as well. This man really truly knows no bounds. Why would he do that? What did this poor dog ever do to Charles? And it's not like the pup could rat Charles out to the police or anything. But later that day, Charles and Caril decided it would be best to flee yet again another home that they just turned into a crime scene. Our Bonnie and Clyde 2.0 hit the road again, but got their car stuck in the mud, so they had to continue on foot. And that's when a sweet local teenage couple approached Charles and Caril, offering them a ride. Charles and Caril took the local couple up on the ride, but it didn't take long until the villainous duo threatened their generous chauffeurs into driving into a nearby storm cellar where Charles physically violated the 16-year-old girl before snuffing them both and dumping their remains in the cellar. I mean, about 10 hours into this road trip somewhere in Wyoming, Charles decided the car they stole was too hot. That's when Charles spotted a car on the road that he wanted to be his. Inside the car was a 37-year-old traveling salesman named Merle taking a nap in his Buick on the side of the highway. Charles approached the Buick, tapped on the window to wake up the driver, and fired at Merle, commanding him to get out of the car. Merle was a stubborn one and decided to stay in his car, so Charles just kept sending bullets his way. Moments later, a guy named Joe saw the two cars on the side of the road and pulled over to help. Charles asked Joe to help release an emergency brake on Merle's Buick, and by the time Joe saw Merle's limp body squished against the dashboard, it was too late. Charles had already drawn his weapon on Joe. Let's just take a moment to recognize the fact that Charles had to ask for help in releasing a parking brake. They weren't super popular back then, so when Charles tried to drive away and the car stalled, he was like, what do I do now? But back to the standoff. So we've got Charles versus Joe. Charles seemed to have an advantage since he was the one with the weapon, but Joe was a big guy, or at least much bigger than Charles. Joe knew he had to fight for his life, so he started wrestling Charles in an attempt to get the weapon out of his hands. Joe was actually able to get it away from Charles, but sometime during their scuffle, a sheriff's deputy pulled up to the scene. That's when Caril ran toward him, screaming for help, saying that Charles was going to whack her next. Charles hopped in the car he had been driving all along and drove off. The sheriff confirmed Charles's identity with Caril, and just like that, the chase was on. Officers set up roadblocks around Douglas, Wyoming, and posted up just waiting for Charles to show himself. Sometime after that, Charles zoomed through the roadblock and the police chief started chasing chasing him at over 100 miles an hour. A county sheriff, who was also in the car, began firing at Charles. Finally, one of the bullets hit the back of the window of Charles's car, which caused a bunch of glass to fly everywhere. One of the glass shards hit Charles, who immediately started gushing fluid. Now, in response, Charles slammed on the brakes, which allowed the cops to catch up to him. One of the sheriffs later said that the only reason Charles slammed on his brakes and eventually got out was because Charles thought he was going to bleed out. The following day, Charles appeared before a county justice of the peace in Wyoming. Since most of Charles's crimes occurred in Nebraska, it would make the most sense for him to be tried there. Charles honestly thought both states would give him the ultimate sentence, so he chose to be extradited from Wyoming to Nebraska. But if Charles did his research on Wyoming, he'd know that the governor at the time opposed sentencing criminals to be executed. And that, my friends, is why knowledge is power. If Charles knew that tidbit of information, he may have been spared. Well, Charles's trial began in May of 1958 in Nebraska. He first claimed that he forced Caril to come with him on his villainous journey, but then he switched up his story a bunch of times, landing on the claim that Caril committed the crimes with him on her own accord. The jury found Charles guilty and he was sentenced to be electrocuted. Caril's trial wasn't as simple. Even though Charles eventually claimed she was his sidekick, Caril said she was held hostage and forced to aid Charles against her will. This is so confusing. Caril was then found guilty and sentenced to life in prison at age 14. Now, isn't that insane? She definitely had the crimes in her repertoire to deserve that sentencing. It's just so wild that a 14-year-old girl could be charged like that. Now, Charles ended up only getting charged for whacking one of his 11 victims, but that was enough to send him to the grave because on June 25th, 1959, he was executed by electric chair. Caril, on the other hand, got her prison sentence reduced quite a bit and only ended up serving 17 years at a women's correctional center in Nebraska. In 1976, Caril was paroled and she moved to Michigan, where she changed her name to Claire. She literally just switched around her letters a bit, and voila, she's a new woman. Caril eventually got married, but in 2013, she and her husband got in a bad car accident that left her a widow. Since then, she's been trying to receive a pardon to alleviate the burden of being named the perpetrator of the crimes, and even has the support of some of the victims' relatives who believe her side of the story. In February of 2020, her pardon application was denied by the Nebraska Parole Board. The board turned the applications down because they said pardons restore a felon's rights. They don't absolve them of their crimes. You would think that Claire would look something like that up before going through the trouble of filing an application. But after all that said and done, one question remains: why did Charles and maybe Caril do what they did? This series of crimes was one of the worst the country had ever seen. The whole state of Nebraska, as well as the entire country, was in a state of shock and panic as the slaying spree occurred. Aside from Charles' first gas station victim, the other 10 were snuffed in 3 days. It's a lot of crime in a super short period of time. The Starkweather slayings basically marked the end of a quiet and safe feeling of neighborhoods across America and the beginning of the wild and turbulent 60s. So as with most criminals who commit heinous crimes, Charles had quite an interesting and troublesome upbringing. Charles ended up being the third of 7 children, and considering his parents' income, I'm sure you can imagine money was kind of tight. All throughout school, Charles was bullied for being bow-legged, speech-impaired, and nearsighted. As Charles started to grow up and fill out, he became pretty good looking and started to seek revenge against those who picked on him. Oh yeah, and Charles also saw the movie Rebel Without a Cause and became so obsessed with James Dean that he started to dress and act like him. At 16, Charles dropped out of college, and within the next 2 years, he started dating Caril. Charles and Caril fell in love in the snap of a finger, but it seemed like everyone in the circle didn't like the couple being together. But even after hearing all about his story, there's nothing about it that makes up for him taking the lives of so many innocent people. The fact that most of Charles's victims were random makes me believe that he truly was just a crazy person with a skewed agenda. But I can't decide if I think Caril was in on it or not. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.